Show. The Nomiki Show. Yeah, We clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Well, hello, happy holidays. We are going to be putting out some specials. We're doing best ofs. So if you missed some of our greatest interviews and conversations from the year, this is when you get to watch them. Always grateful to you and stay in solidarity. It's no secret that the Democrats sucked money away from state parties and local organizing, but it was simultaneously happening. It didn't happen just over the Obama years. It started back late 70s. But simultaneously, this was happening as unions were being, they were declaring war. The Koch brothers were declaring war on unions. And, the way that I see, so we had the House for 30 years until, was it 94? We lost the House. That to me is a response to the Democratic Party and unions being disconnected, not just from each other strategically, because union members were purged from the Democratic Party membership, but also with the grassroots. And so when you don't have unions organizing and recruiting, and I mean, when I was a kid, I used to make phone calls at union halls. I don't even know if people do that anymore for their local candidates. And I'd stuff envelopes. I mean, this is a different era, but it's just the Democratic Party used to always be hand in hand, recruiting candidates, recruiting staff, organizing, training in every single city in the country. And I feel like it's a shame that people have to take it upon themselves, like they did in Georgia, and fundraise for their local county party or local group to make phone calls and register voters. I mean, that's what the Democratic Party used to be in conjunction with unions. Yeah. So with that, my big takeaway from this and question is, why is union leadership so afraid right now? I mean, I understand that they've been under attack, but we've got a Democratic president. I mean, this is the time to move. So where's the fear here?
You know what the fear is? The fear is the piece that I focused on, which is confusing access with power. And that's a fundamental error of judgment that many make, but unions make it more because in a beaten down progressive movement, outside of a handful of, Warnocks, frankly, like top Black church leaders in the sort of legacy civil rights movement, outside of a handful of key actors in the civil rights movement institutionally, I don't mean really individually, institutionally, the labor movement is still the most powerful movement within the progressive tent. As beaten down as we are, we still have more access and more power and more money. And so what happens, and it really was a huge mistake under the Obama administration, is that the minute that Obama won, he turned around and basically said to the entire labor movement and to every progressive group, by the way, Valerie Jarrett, I'm sorry, but playing the role that she played in the early years of Obama, I mean, talk about someone who was enforcing discipline like an enforcer. Jarrett basically said to many people I know very closely, you can test us in public. You'll never even attend a meeting. You won't be invited to like the lowest level meeting in the history of the White House. You will be out. And so there was it was so intense the first year, how strongly they said to people, you will get in relationship to how nice you are to us in public, basically. You will not contest the Barack Obama administration in public. That was like super strong and enforced. And when people crossed it, they cut them off. Like they cut them out of meetings, they cut it. And part of what I say in the article is, who gives a crap, really? Because the two institutions that won big under Obama were the two sectors of the progressive movement who said, we don't care. Like, we're not going to do being nice to you, playing behind the scenes, backroom deal making, thinking that we're important because we're showing up in our suits to your meetings at the White House and to your cocktail parties. We don't care. Like, we're out to win. That was the LGBT community and the immigrants' rights community. Yep. Those two and they were cut out. I mean, in the long history of the Obama administration, if you go back to the inside plays that were going on, they did cut them out of like formal, you're not on our commissions, you're not getting appointments to low-level positions. And people were like, yeah, we don't really care because we're dying, or we're getting, killed and we can't be married and everything else that the LGBT community demanded. And the immigrants' rights community, these are the people who went in and said, yeah, we don't care. We're going to protest. We're going to occupy. We're going to demand. We're going to go after you to hold you accountable to our base. And they got the biggest gains in that 8-year period. And that's the lesson I'm trying to lift up in the article, is that we're not going to win things by being nice to the Biden people. We're going to win things by actually out-organizing them, building power, showing power, and getting back to the work the way we know how to do it, which is holding politicians accountable. That's like, to me, that's the first thing I learned as a young trade union organizer coming out of a very smart, very good union that I didn't realize how good and smart we were way back in the day when I was a lot younger. The very first thing I learned and the very first thing I was taught was, when we elect a politician, the first thing we do is put a test in front of them to hold them accountable to that demand. Because we need to teach a lesson to them early on that we have power and we are not going to just acquiesce to you. That's like the opposite of what the national trade union movement is doing right now. So, the longer I live, the more I realize my very first experiences were so good in terms of getting strategy right. Now you got to have an organization strong enough to actually hold them accountable. But if the labor movement, if even like the 8 unions that are the ones that I call still trying, I would say there's the labor movement and then there's the 8 unions that are still trying. If even just those 8 would agree on strategy, we could seriously hold the Biden administration accountable to a set of demands that workers and the working class are desperate for in the United States.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we've broken this down with different experts in the last few weeks, saying, even though unions are weaker than they've ever been, even though there are good unions and mediocre unions and definitely some bad unions,
yep.
The good ones, if they just got on the same page and pressured them, there's so much at stake that Biden, he owes everything to labor at this point. And also he has to do something. The moment is the crisis. It's not the movement that has leverage. It's the moment that has the leverage. So, with that being said, for those of us who don't have, in the audience, who don't have experience in unions, how do we reform from within? How do we make the leadership more accountable to its members so that they're actually taking those moves?
Yeah, two things and 2 examples. One is, I was just involved in a call this morning, as I frequently am, working with a lot of teachers unions who themselves are making demands on their national leadership, right? So you've got strong local unions. It's the only way it's really going to happen is when same relationship between our movement and Biden and Harris and company has got to be between rank and file members and their local unions and their national leadership. It's about holding people accountable, right? So there have been an increasing series of demands, certainly in the teachers unions, where you've got strong enough locals from Chicago to LA to Oakland to fill in the blank, like a bunch of them, who are coordinating and making demands on their national leadership to demand more, not less. Right now, to demand, we impeach the genius lunatic Confederacy member before he's out, with the language that says you can never run again. So that's the way it's going to work. Even in 2016, after the 2016, just if you look at the teacher unions as an example, in 2016, when the American Federation of Teachers did this super early endorsement of Clinton, it outraged a lot of the rank and file teacher union leaders. And so the result was they came back and changed the language 2 years later in the national convention so that the national leadership couldn't go out and do an early endorsement without the sign off on the base. So that's real accountability. That's a really good example of you've got to have locals strong enough to take risk. And almost the same parallel discussion goes on. If you've got local leaders that members aren't pushing, who may want to rise into national leadership or something, they're going to think to themselves, I shouldn't cross the top union leadership. Well, first of all, it's wrong to think that making a demand of your union leadership is crossing them, right? Like if you've got a set of demands and you were elected locally that you're making on them, that's a completely legitimate way to move. So that's one thing. And that's real. And that's got to happen in a bunch of unions. That's strong locals, that members make demands on their locals, and strong locals make demands on the national union to push them harder and farther than they're willing to go to get them out of their comfort zone, to not be worried about pissing off, Harris or Biden or whoever it is, or whoever the chief of staff role is going to be, or whoever any number of the gatekeepers are. Like, don't worry about offending the gatekeepers, worry about losing. I'd worry more about losing than offending a gatekeeper. That's one. Two is the other part that I wrote about, which holds all of labor accountable to a broader social movement agenda, is sort of the method and the approach of rank and file members themselves being the ones to deeply engage their broader community in the coalition work at the local level, so that it's going to be harder, so that when you get to the local level, a state level or a big city or whatever, local, out of the national riffraff of the headquarters, in campaigns that I run, the thing I always do is we chart the members' connections, not just to each other at work. That's a good union organizer does that. But the thing I'm suggesting that good union organizers have to do next, which people don't do because it's not in our tradition yet, is then equally systematically chart the relationships that existing rank and file members have inside of their broader community, to their church groups, to their civil rights groups, to their immigrant rights groups. And then the members become a source of holding, using their own community ties to hold their unions accountable to broader social justice goals, to a form of political education that's bigger. So the very first campaign I ran in Stamford, Connecticut, for a second, years, I'm dating myself, so I don't even know if you were born. When were you born? Anyway, a long damn time ago, last century.
4.
So last century, in like one of the first campaigns I ran, that's when I learned this lesson, that we charted all the members' connections. In particular, we had a lot of them in the big Black churches in the community that we were organizing in. And there was a housing crisis emerging. And I was saying to the leadership, we got to work on this, this plan to gentrify the whole region. And the unions, honestly, which I talk about in my first book, the union leaders were pretty good. We're like, that's not our issue. Why don't you call up Acorn? Acorn still existed. That's how long ago this was. Anyway, but like, you go call up those housing groups. And I'm like a young organizer going, how come when I'm on the doors with rank and file members and all they're talking about is the fact that they're all going to be moved out of the city, then that's a labor issue. And we were able to leverage that becoming a major labor issue where we put in our skill and resources because we had the members go to their churches and have the churches make the demands of the union leaders when the union leaders were making demands on the picket lines, right? So that's member-led accountability over a local program to hold the trade union movement accountable to broader social justice demands. So we have to strengthen the trade unions, but also have a strong community-based sector that can hold them accountable to things like Black Lives Matter and much more than that. Housing, for God's sakes, like really big issues that are affecting workers.
Right. Especially right now. We have a question from one of our supporters, Vinny Holiday. He says, do you think union culture has to change such that members are not simply passive members, but also politically aware and active? And I think that's part of the point you were just making. But how would you do that institutionally, internally within a union?
Yeah. So I think that this process of charting the members' connections that they have already to their community organically is a central way to do it. Mm-hmm. And it's so uncommon. It's so rarely done. But when we do it, what begins to happen is that rank and file workers begin to understand the broader political analysis of the labor market in which they live. So in Philadelphia, I'll give another example, get myself out of Connecticut. Now I'll go to Philadelphia in 2016. In Philadelphia in 2016, we were organizing most of the nurses in Philadelphia hospitals to form new unions. And we got to the point where the organization inside the shop was really strong, meeting inside the hospitals. Like the nurses had now built really strong internal organization. And we still didn't have enough power at the bargaining table to win yet. Like we needed more power than we had. So then we went into phase 2, which was controversial. We did it. It always is when I'm leading it, but the members like it. So that's good enough for me. The members like it. We began to chart all their connections to, Black churches and all the places that they already had connections in their community. And when we began to sort of show a power structure analysis of Greater Philadelphia to a room of 300 newly organized rank and file nurse leaders across 7 hospitals, and we began to show, so your CEO is in a relationship to this set of power players in the city, but you're the leader of your 3 biggest, most powerful Black churches that just hosted Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, fill in the blank. It was 2016, right? Everyone's coming to Philadelphia. But we began to show in simple maps the relationship between their hospital CEOs and how political power was working in Philadelphia. those nurses, political education was rocked in a way it never really had been. And they were all the first to say it. So part of what I say in the article is we have to build stronger, more resilient communities. And the labor movement needs to see part of its job as doing that. And the method to do it is this thing I call comprehensive charting, where you go from charting workplace connections to charting our connections to the community through the lives of the rank and file. Because if you, let's acknowledge what a worker is going to say. It's going to be hard to go up against your union leadership if you're one rank and file worker. But what we did in Connecticut 30 whatever years ago, just about, is I understood that. I had been saying to the union leadership, we need to work on this housing fight, gentrification, bulldoze all the housing. And the leaders were resisting. So we got some people who had more power than either me as an organizer or the rank and file leaders as individuals. We had them quietly working the very powerful Black church leadership in that city. And then they went to the union leaders and said, you want us to help you on these organizing drives and on these strikes and picket lines and budget fights? We're down for that. And we need you in turn to have us, to be with us in stopping the gentrification of the city. And we rose to that moment, right? So it's for each worker, even in a local fight, it's about thinking about that power analysis and who can you bring along with you to make the demands of your leadership, who, not just members, that's first and foremost, but then who else can you bring along that's going to help move the local union leadership, just like we need to bring those players into debates with the national union leadership, to move people on a broader agenda. That's a social justice agenda that's going to build a stronger, more vibrant, politically educated team of voters going to the polls in the next election. Like that is what we need in this country desperately.
And what I love about that is you reminding people of the power that they already have. I think a lot of folks feel hopeless in these moments of crisis, and then when you start to break it down, you think, oh no, I've got a whole community here, and they have my back because they have a stake at the table as well. We have a question real quick before we wrap up. I love talking power with you because people ask tough questions about power and don't have an opportunity. It's great. So Columbia McAleeb, and I apologize if I didn't say your name right, says, respect to you. Hope to attend your strike school. Are you doing another strike school?
Doing another strike school. Yeah, we haven't announced a date yet, May or June, though. People should be looking for like a May, June.
Perfect. I will be at that. What are your thoughts on using Pelosi's reelection to speakership as leverage for a strategy? And of course, this is sort of an evolution, a smart question though, evolution out of this big Medicare for All debacle that happened on the podcast left, I'll say.
Yeah. And I have to be honest, I've only been on the margins of watching that debate a little bit. So
you're fine. I'm glad you were on the margins.
Worrying about Georgia turnout was more important anyway.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? Interesting.
I think there's a couple of things. To the degree that I finally had to say to some people, what is this fight going on? Anyway, so without getting into it, I will say, as someone who talks a lot about what we call structure tests, that part of how we know when we're ready to win is that structure test can reveal for us, are we capable of winning? What I try to counsel people not to do are structure tests that reveal our weakness,
Wow, that's profound.
Do all the time. Like go on out there and yell about something and demand some vote when the point of what organizers call real structure tests are we do escalating actions where we begin to understand how close are we to having enough power to win. I hate, and here's the union example. Unions do this all the time. They'll say, Fridays are going to be a red t-shirt day. Teacher unions do this. Or a lot of unions do it. Friday, every week, every Friday, you come, you get your orientation, you've been hired at some job or something, and they're like, oh, by the way, and every Friday, we ask everyone to wear their union shirt, to work. And then the first thing I say to people is, that's interesting. What do you do to make sure that everyone actually is wearing the union shirt? And they're like, well, we just asked them. I'm like, okay, well, that's great. So how many are actually wearing the shirt that you've declared to the employer? Friday is union logo day. And you have like 2% of the workers wearing it. So what are you telegraphing to the boss? That you have no organization, no loyalty, and no structure inside the workplace. Don't do it. So that's my indirect way of saying we only should be calling for things. I feel like we're better off doing the work that builds our power so that when we make a move, that's a really significant move, we're going to win. I mean, I don't just go on strike because I'm pissed off at the boss and feel like I'm going on strike today. I'm not going to have workers go on strike until we have a credible understanding that the level of organization and unity and power built is going to give us a fair shot at winning that fight. So I'm more interested in what's the hard work we have to do to get to the point where we can actually really win the fight. Now, yes, there's some whole debate about there once in a while, we need to force a vote, whatever. But generally speaking, it's not my bias at all. My bias is, why reveal weakness when what we should be doing is building our strength?
And not only that, I mean, historically, this would be very dangerous. If we were not in this era, it would actually, at least directly, not like through policies and lack of response to Medicare for all or whatever, it would actually kill people.
Directly. Yeah, absolutely. So to me, it's, again, to the degree that I was frittering around the edges of listening to some of that stuff, I just think, I mostly think that there aren't enough people in the sort of self-declared left who have ever had to put their something on the line, ours is on the line, in a win-lose contestation, and be held accountable to what the outcome was and what the implications of that outcome were. So for those of us who actually take on really hard fights that have really huge consequences regularly, where 10, 20,000, 100,000, 400,000 people's lives are on the line going into a strike, for example, or a big union election, we're not doing that unless we think we had a reasonable chance to win. That's right. Period, right? Winning matters. And I feel like there's this weird weakness in the US left or the US progressive movement, whereby focusing a lot on winning is like somehow something that we don't do. You know what I mean? And I always think our movements get bigger when we win. Georgia's victories are going to lead to other Southern states' movements believing that they can now win. When the Chicago teachers walked off the job in 2012, they single-handedly, through one huge strike, re-raised the expectations of the education sector that the strike can work again. And so we're having winning strikes again. People need to see people winning, and that then raises their expectation and inspires them. If you see people losing, it isn't very motivating.
Sunset Lake CBD is a farmer-owned company that ships craft CBD products directly from their farm in Vermont to your door. I talk about them all the time. I mean it, because I got a lot of issues. I got aches and pains. I got sleeping issues. I have a dog who has some issues because, he changed his habits. They say that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, he developed new habits, new tricks. When we had the lockdown, it was like the best time of his little life because he was around his humans all the time, never left alone. But then when the lockdown eased up and we could leave the house again, he developed severe anxiety. But you know what helped him? CBD. I never would have thought it. We put little tinctures, drops from the tinctures in his bowl. It helped him a little bit. He calmed down. We have a little nanny cam. So we watch him. He used to be pacing around the house. He would, go into the garbage. He'd have little accidents around the house. But when we started giving him CBD, he just chilled. He was just like, all right, I'll take a little walk. I'll sit by the window and look for mommy and other mommy, my mom and me. And now he's a chill dog. But Sunset Lake CBD got it. They understood that dogs also have anxiety. So they have a new product that is Sunset Lake CBD dog biscuits. It's transformative. So what's so special other than their products being so great? I have tried CBD before. I'm telling you, I didn't really like it. I was convinced otherwise when I tried Sunset Lake CBD because I'm at least open to this stuff. And it really did make a difference in my life, in my personal, with my aches and pains, but also my sleeping habits. it's partly also because I think that they just are good people and they care. They not only they took an old Ben and Jerry's farm in Vermont and they decided to diversify it and grow premium hemp on that farm, but they also pay their workers a minimum wage of $15 an hour. That's the start. And their employees own the majority of the company. And on top of that, they support independent media like our show, The Majority Report, and The David Pakman Show. They're an incredible company. And when you support them, you are actually supporting rural economies and creating sustainable work in those communities. We know how hard it is. You can today get 20% off of your order, but you have to type in Nomi. I'm telling you guys, you got to type in Nomi. This is important. I found out that I had family members who were buying products and were not typing in Nomi and getting their 20% off. So if you go to sunsetlakecbd.com, type in NOMI and you will get 20% off of your entire order. They always have different products coming out and deals. Sign up for their mailing list. It makes a huge difference, but always type in Nomi, NOMI, and you will get 20% off of your entire order. Go to sunsetlakecbd.com. Perfect holiday gift, and just gift to yourself too for the new year.
You've been making news in Hawaii for the work you're doing around the economic recovery. Can you first just describe like what the agency is set up to do?
Yeah, good question. So this agency is kind of a gift from the 1960s. It's really interesting, some of the things that feminists institutionalized for us that are kind of lying in wait and really just depend on who organizes to use them. So we're the oldest, actually, the state commission on the status of women in the US, although Hawaii is a colony of the US in the Pacific. And we are statewide, and we also have corollaries in every county. So it's this nice like local to state level system. And I think a lot of people were surprised to have us put this out because it was so unlikely to come from the US because of the dominance of like neoliberal logics here and where the state of mainstream feminism is. So yeah, that's just a little bit about us. And we're directly involved in the ways that the state makes policies, its resources. We're basically like the main policy consultant for legislators in Hawaii and the resource center for women here.
Are most of your state lawmakers or say whichever lawmakers exist in Hawaii, are they receptive to what you put out?
I mean, one does not simply ask for economy where colonial relations and class distinctions are removed, but there is more social visibility around women's oppression because of the COVID-19 pandemic, for sure. And so there has been a really interesting reception among legislators, especially at the local level, so at the county levels. Every single county but Honolulu, which is about to introduce legislation, has passed legislation committing to following our feminist economic recovery and how they structure their plans for the local government level. So that just happened organically.
Can you explain what the feminist economic recovery plan is? How it was built, what was the process of putting this together?
Well, the context is really important. In Hawaii right now, we still have the highest unemployment rate in the United States. And at one point we were at 40% because we're hyper reliant on patriarchal institutions and really just fragile extractive industries. So, literally war, tourism, and luxury development, basically. And so those failed us. War, maybe not, but tourism fell off a cliff. And because of the state managing this kind of sweet spot of capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, where women are like maximally exploited in the workplace and the home, women are concentrated in these feminized industries, these low wage industries. And so there was a very clear reaction to the impact on women in our community of activists and advocates. So right when the crisis hit about a year ago, we pulled together a team of women, like a motley crew. We had women from, deaf liberation activists. We had Native Hawaiian public health experts. We had students, just this diverse group of women who wanted to make sure that the short-term plan represented a very specific type of feminism that was, had a strong historical analysis and transnational analysis. Like, I'm a Filipina immigrant family-based activist, right? So I have that kind of global perspective. And we all came together and wrote this plan in about a week's time because we knew we had to keep up with the pace of the state and what was happening. So yeah, it happened really from our community and the trust that we built with working with activists here. And some of the elements of the plan are short-term and others are really a declaration of where we want to go. So
okay, so let's talk about some of the short-term aspects. What's made up in the plan? Short-term.
Well, some of the features are pushing back against the immediate knee-jerk to rely on funding and programs and gutting social programs that women rely on to fund the recovery. The plan is called Building Bridges, Not Walking on Backs, which is, of course, a shout out to Gloria Anzaldúa, because we didn't want this to be balanced on women with the budget crisis that we're facing. Another thing is, there's this push for green jobs as an alternative to tourism. But as it stands, 78% of renewable jobs are held by men. So it's, you see the gender segregation. And so investing in that without counteracting that will leave women behind. So that was another focus. Also allocating 20% of the federal funding coming in, the massive amounts of money, to Native Hawaiians to use as they see fit to recover, to honor the obligation that the state of Hawaii has to Native Hawaiians was one of the other short-term proposals. And then, building up a social infrastructure for women, from maternal and birthing systems to, universal free public childcare from 0 to 5, just things that are necessary for the scaffold of the economy. So there are a lot of different features, but they're all in motion, many of them.
I asked you about the receptivity of this plan by lawmakers, but, as you know probably very well, when you go and you lobby a lawmaker, they may like one part of the plan, but they may come up with some sort of either excuse for not supporting another aspect of it, or maybe an incremental response to it. Have you seen any sort of responses that, maybe they want to pick the plan apart and implement parts of it?
Yeah, I mean, there are some urgent and glaring overt pieces of sexism that are playing out during the crisis. Like, we have the permanent state telework policy for public workers prohibits you to caregive while you're teleworking.
What?
Yeah, it's caused like massive confusion, crisis for public workers.
What? How is that legal?
So that's an example of something that right now we're in legislative session that's being taken up. So there's some really basic reforms that need to happen there that are before the legislature. Also, like emergency and housing vouchers, like housing assistance during the crisis. A lot of landlords were rejecting them because in Hawaii we don't have any statutes that prevent source of income discrimination. So you can just say no Section 8. don't even bother applying. I will not even consider Section 8 or any other government source of funding for rent. So that's another one. There are, a really visible sign of patriarchy is the violence that's emerged and heightened during COVID. So all of our anti-violence service providers are fighting for their budgets, fighting for technical reforms too during session. So there's a lot going on from the plan. There's not one like omnibus package, but there are a lot of, like I said, pieces of it in motion right now.
I don't know if you guys have heard, but the Proud Boys are now running for local office. They have an actual strategy to run for school boards and city councils and in local communities because it is actually more achievable. It is frankly an easier run. You don't have to raise as much money. The districts are smaller. You can count on knocking on doors in the community building that you have, but it's also extremely dangerous. We all know that the Democrats have put little to no investment in basically a more expansive approach to running for office. They have put little to no money in building a pipeline over the last 15 years. And that has led to really dire consequences as losing legislatures that the Democrats used to control, which has affected how reproductive health functions in that state, whether or not there are clinics, whether or not you can have an abortion in a timely manner, whether or not your school, your public school gets funded, whether or not unions are strong. Are you in a right to work state or do you have a union state? This matters. And when the Democrats don't put money into local parties, into organizing that pipeline, people forget what the Democrats are supposed to represent. And then simultaneously, unions are weakened. So the unions are less associated with the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party is less associated with unions. So it's a prime opportunity for conservatives, which they've been doing for the last 40 years at this point, to invest locally and take over. And now it's even worse because it's not just Koch brother conservatives anymore. It is far-right extremists, the types of people who stormed the Capitol. Well, we're not going to wait for the Democratic Party. Matriarch is an organization that runs working class women, progressive women, for office. And in 2020, we had a wonderful slate of candidates that ran for Congress. Cori Bush was one of our first founding members and obviously a huge win. She's a former nurse. She's a working class woman and she had experience. She's a mother. All of these things are really important. She's been part of the community. People knew who she was. It took a few shots, but that's actually how politics works. It takes an average of 3 times for a woman to run for office. We don't even know the statistics on what it takes for a working woman because it is harder for a working woman to run for office when they don't have access to money, when they don't come from wealth, when the establishment is not on their side. So Matriarch is expanding in 2022, and we are going to be endorsing candidates up and down the ballot. We're going to be endorsing congressional candidates all the way down to those school board candidates because that is what matters. And if you are a working class progressive woman or you know of one that's exceptional, we urge you to tell them or run yourself at that local level. Running for Congress is really hard. You have to raise a lot of money to be viable because you have to hire staff and organizers and get your name out there and have a plan. But local is much more achievable, and that's why the Proud Boys are doing this. We believe that the model of taking on the far right is through working women. I mean, they're so scared of women, clearly. Their targets are the squad. Their targets are women across the board. There is deep, deep, deep-rooted misogyny because they're scared of powerful women. Maybe it's some mommy issues. I don't know. But we're very excited that we are going to be hosting a training on January 29th. It is a free training. Every single candidate or potential candidate that runs gets to go to this training for free because we are focusing on working class. We want this to be accessible to as many women as possible who are thinking about running or running, but it does cost money to put on this training. So we are trying to raise $30,000, hopefully by the end of the year. We are on our way. If you can contribute whatever you can to help us do this training for free, it'll make a huge difference because we want to make sure everybody has a shot, everybody has access to this training. It is not your typical training. We are going to be leaning in on class, what class barriers present in running for office, what systemic barriers are out there, and how you can overcome those systemic barriers when you don't come from wealth, when you don't come from the establishment, and you've never worked in politics before. What it means to be a strong candidate, how to build a viable campaign, how to get those big endorsements early, how to hire people, who to trust. What is your narrative? Because here's the thing. A narrative in Astoria, Queens is very different than possibly a narrative for someone running in Arizona, in Peoria, Arizona. And that's important. That's very important. What is the psychology of messaging? Issues are extremely important, but how do you message those issues to your community? This is the kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about this training, but we need to get there. We're trying to raise $30,000. If you can contribute whatever, it'll make a big difference. I promise you, we are doing this the old-fashioned way, crowdsourced way. So we're very grateful to you all. You go check out that link. The link is on screen. It's a bit.ly. Let's put that link back up so people can see it, and definitely share it, and hopefully get some folks to sign up. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. I am so excited to have Nina Lakhani on. She's an environmental justice reporter for The Guardian, and she's the author of Who Killed Berta Cáceres, Dams, Death Squads, and an Indigenous Defenders Battle for the Planet. You may recall in 2016, in the heat of the Democratic primary, and I say that for a reason, Berta Cáceres was killed. She was a Honduran environmental activist and indigenous leader, and she's a co-founder and coordinator of the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, and she won the Goldman Environmental Prize just the year before. This was a hot topic on the campaign trail, if you guys remember, from 2016, and I'm just really excited to have Nina on to talk a little bit more about her legacy and what happened. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi. So I mean, let's just start, I guess, with the basics. Who was Berta Cáceres?
So Berta Cáceres was an indigenous Lenca woman who, as you said, was a co-founder of the grassroots organization COPIN, which is very much a organization fighting for the rights, fighting for land rights, human rights, right to natural resources and self-determination. So she was very much a grassroots leader, but she was also, a very sharp, smart political analyst, and, a great narrator. And she had this really unique ability to communicate, to understand local issues in a global context and explain them no matter who she was talking to. And all of those things, I think, made her really unique and really made her quite dangerous for the state.
What was so dangerous about what she stood for, and especially in 2016? I mean, we're not talking about the 50s here.
Well, I think, a good way to think about it is that, every conflict in Latin America for the last 550 years have been about land and natural resources. Who has access to this, to water, to land, to wealth, natural wealth. And, you've had different people, different actors, governments, the crowd, different, royalty in Europe, and companies, all mixed together, trying to take control over these natural resources, right? And so her ability to, first of all, communicate with people, to unite, rural and urban people, teachers and farmers, and her ability, to really absorb and understand these very sort of big global issues, economic, military, geopolitical issues, and see how they were sort of manifesting in her corner of the world or in other corners of the world, meant that actually, she was she just was really influential. She could really sort of galvanize people, and she didn't just do the grassroots protesting stuff. She did legal cases. She challenged people in Congress. She was just this really sort of she had so many different skills, right? And I think because when you're talking about money, when you're talking about natural resources, you're always talking about money. Her work opposing a dam in particular, but many other projects, threaten the profits of investors, international and national investors, and that in the end is always about the money.
Was she getting close to a win? I mean, was the public pressure growing so much that they felt the need to, we'll get to her death in a minute, but was the pressure growing tremendously?
Yeah, she was awarded the Goldman Prize because of her success in leading a campaign by Lenca communities to stop the construction of an internationally funded dam, a hydroelectric dam, on a sacred river, which had been sanctioned after the coup in 2009, along with hundreds of other sort of environmentally destructive projects without any consultation. So that's why she was awarded the prize, right, in 2015. A few months later, it turned out that the company had actually been planning and plotting to keep constructing the dam. They had just moved the main site across the river. So in October of 2015, they start construction work again. And so therefore, her opposition, the protests, the roadblocks, etc., start up again. And so does the repression, the threats, the intimidation, the deployment of security forces, the deployment of justice sort of law officers to repress her and the community. And what we know is that from that point on, she and other leaders were put under surveillance. They were paid informants that were used to spy on her, to track her every movement, and that the company relied on law enforcement, on security forces, on judges, on prosecutors to enable this sort of repression to go on.
What was the company using the dam for? What were they looking to invest in?
So it wasn't. It was to generate electricity and energy, right? And so in communities where most people don't have light, don't have electricity, but that energy would not have been for that community, right? It would not have been that community. It would most likely have been either gone to the national grid or to fund or to power very energy hungry projects like mining, right? So but what it would have meant for those communities is death, right? Because without that river, there is no life in these communities. The river is what enables them to feed, to get food, medicines, water for their animals, right? At the end, when that if that dam had been constructed, it would have diverted the water from that river for electricity and so-called clean energy or green energy, as we like to call it in the West. But it would have ended up forcibly displacing many, hundreds, if not thousands, of people in that region.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the U.S.'s role in all of this. Foreign policy at the time, this was still under the Obama administration. When Secretary Clinton was running for president, this became a topic that was brought up, at least in the activist campaign trail, quite a bit, a criticism of Secretary Clinton's policy. Of course, we understand the instability of Central America and how that has affected our border policies in the United States. So can we just talk a little bit about what the U.S.'s role in all of this was right at that time?
The instability in Central America is because of US policies. Let's be clear about that, right? These aren't happening just because on their own. The US has interfered and tried to control Central America for decades and decades, okay? And for example, in Honduras, there was no armed forces in Honduras until there was no sort of national armed forces in Honduras until 1954, when a US written piece of legislation in English gets passed to create the armed forces, which allows the US to use Honduras as a military base, a military satellite, which has continued to do so all the way through the Cold War, all the civil wars of Central America. That's where the US was based. That's where it trained Guatemalans to overthrow the democratically elected government that led to a civil war of 36 years. It trained the Contras there. It trained the worst military killers there in Honduras, right? So, and in the last 15 years, it's been its base to fight its ill-fated war on drugs. So the US tentacles are all over Honduras in America and Central America.
Base to fight the war on drugs. I mean, what I think is so fascinating about our policies is there is now like an open consensus that these policies were failed policies. There have been countless documents that have been released, and yet we're still there. Kind of, it's just reshaped a little bit. So how is Honduras key to fighting the war on drugs?
Well, I guess, so in 2009 was a coup. Let's just start there, right? There was a coup, and a democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya, was flown out on a helicopter to Costa Rica 6 months before the end of his term, right? This sort of was orchestrated by this network of elites in the country, military, political, economic, religious, right? Who were not willing to, I mean, what I conclude in my book is that more than anything, what motivated that was the desire to sell off the country's natural resources, because that was what we have seen unfold ever since then. Now, I have not found any evidence that I can directly say the US participated in that, but they certainly enabled it to stick, right? They certainly, I think very quickly, while Obama called it a coup, Hillary Clinton very, very quickly was talking about new elections. You know, she was suddenly talking about Manuel Zelaya being ousted as a victory against Chavism, you know, aligning with Hugo Chavez, which was just utter nonsense, right? And since then, that has unleashed this utter nightmare in Honduras. You know, it became the most dangerous country in the world outside a war zone. 80% of cocaine destined for the US started transiting through Honduras. It's the most dangerous place in the world to be a land defender, to be a lawyer, attorney, to practice journalism. It's up there. It has just, and you know, hundreds of thousands of Hondurans have fled that country towards the US since then. Right, that's what's happened. Over the same period, the US has done a lot of training of special forces, war on drug ops and special forces in Honduras. No country has had as many special forces training ops as Honduras has in the last 10 years or so. It sort of shifted from Colombia to Honduras, really, because transit routes were shifted, right? Because drug transit routes were shifted. At the same time, there is no let up in the amount of drugs from South America reaching US. So that's failure number one. Secondly, we've seen all of these countries be utterly militarized, and insecurity and violence just spiral out of control. That is why there are hundreds and thousands of Central Americans fleeing. You know, this sort of toxic mix of poverty, impunity, corruption, violence, you know, that they're not fleeing for it. Now, these aren't people making a decision one day to try their luck in the US. These are people that are fleeing structural and direct violence, you know, which you cannot say that the US has not and does not play a role in, because it does.
And oftentimes, you know, it's they're scared. They've had threats on their lives and their communities, and then they have to navigate through Mexico to the border with these coyotes that are just as dangerous. And then, of course, you know, we know what ends up happening at our borders. You've experienced a lot of threats too, and surveillance and pushback in investigating this book. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then we can talk about her actual how she died, of course.
Yeah, sure. And so, you know, I mean, I met Betha when she was alive, you know, back in 2013. I interviewed her then. And then when she got killed, I, you know, was sent there for The Guardian. I was a freelancer at the time based in Mexico, but and started really investigating her death. And that's how, you know, I ended up writing the book. But when I started publishing stories that really started to expose the sort of, you know, exposed that the official narrative was only a tiny part of the story. So, for example, I published a story quite quickly, within a few months, right, that her name had actually appeared on a military hit list a few weeks before her death. And a military
hit list?
Yeah, a military hit list, which she had told me about herself in 2016, in 2013. But when she got killed, my story was based on an army deserter whose squad was given the hit list, and it was a list of, campesino leaders, social leaders, community leaders, political oppositions, who the military were saying needed to be silenced, right? That, basically they were to target them. So I write that story, and this young deserter, army deserter, he worked for like one of the top, units, like special forces, which the US invests in, right? Which the US trains, which the US invests in. So I write that story, and that's when it all sort of starts, that sort of the minister of, the defense minister, the head of the armed forces come out and give press conferences basically saying, I am trying to ruin the good name of Honduras. We have complaints. I get all these bot campaigns starting out. I get called a media terrorist, and my pictures sort of put out everywhere. And the US ambassador to Honduras at the time, starts up a pretty underhand, off the record campaign to try and discredit me and my reporting. All of it extrajudicial.
How did they? It obviously wasn't above board, but how was the ambassador doing so?
He was going around holding sort of like meetings with different people, basically saying, oh, she doesn't understand how the army works. Oh, she's got this wrong. Just really trying to undermine, saying that there was no evidence of this. And then when I spoke to him myself, because I had put all these questions to the Honduran army and to the US Department of State, right? They chose not to respond to any of the allegations and then launched these campaigns against me. And when I finally spoke to him a few months later, he said to me, if you don't hand over the death list to us that you claim exists and anyone else dies on it, there'll be blood on your hands. That it was my responsibility. And as I pointed out to him, I say, Berta Cáceres denounced the existence of this hit list in 2013. What did you do to investigate then, right? He claimed that his team had investigated my claims and found no evidence of a hit list, yet didn't speak to any single person who I had interviewed, didn't speak to the head of the special forces who ran this, who we know has been involved in setting up death squads in parts of Honduras. It was a complete sham. But that's when it all started, and after that I had to take, I never went back to Honduras by plane. I would go like these really 24-hour journeys sort of overland. And I took, lots of measures. I didn't publish stories while I was in the country until the murder trial, right? When I was there, I was the only journalist covering the trial every day. And I got these false, fake press releases were put out, signed by, well, not fake, the press releases are real, but they were signed by these fake, in groups, farmers groups, claiming that I was inciting violence in a certain part of the country, that I was not a journalist, that I should be declared persona non grata from Honduras, that I was what else did I say? They linked me to organized crime. They then called me a terrorist. All the classic dirty tactics, right? That we've seen being used. But it really, it placed a huge amount of pressure on me. There was a lot of people telling me to come back, not to stay. But that was the intention, right? It's like, okay, the one journalist that won't shut up about this case, let's get her out. And I just couldn't leave, So it was, I remember speaking to a security consultant saying to me, look, my advice to you is to stay inside and order takeout. And I'm like, well, I can't do that for 6 weeks. Do you know what I mean? I'm just,
pre-COVID. Now you can. Now you can definitely do that.
That's my life now. That's just my life now, right? And so it's all of my life. But it was really tense and, just like really difficult, And then since I published a book, a lot of this started again. I've had like bot campaigns and like lots of sort of nasty things being written about me, and the richest man in Honduras sort of making all sorts of threats because he doesn't like what I've said in the book, and about his bank and so forth. So threats come in many different forms, right? They're not just so it's that you're actually you're getting somewhere in terms of the truth, when you upset lots of people, but it's certainly not been easy.
Let's talk about what happened to Berta. and the events that led up to it, because just as you described this, I just finished the Jakarta Method, which is
Right. I haven't read it yet. I really want to.
and I'm thinking, okay, when I'm reading, I'm thinking, how did this happen in the 60s under the Johnson administration? How did this happen? And what you're telling me right now, and granted, it wasn't 1 million people, as far as we know, death squads in 2016, barely being covered in the press, and there's just the tactics seem to have remained.
Yeah, God, yeah. I mean, honestly, I say this in my book that, the killing of Berta Cáceres was like the grand finale of a whole campaign of terror, which had all the hallmarks of, a classic counterinsurgent strategy, bribes, threats, sexual harassment, imprisonment, all of these different things to try and neutralize her because they considered her an enemy. And when none of those things worked, when they couldn't jail her, when they couldn't silence her, when they couldn't force her to leave the country, that's when they decided to kill her. It's classic counterinsurgency, right? And so she, as I said, when the project was restarted, all of these those repressive, measures started to be, rolled out again. And I have to say, she was killed in March 2016. Hired hitmen entered her home and shot her, and she was shot dead in her pajamas in her bedroom. And I think that was very much purposeful, that message. I think the thing is, the people who were profiting from this business, and not just, she was a bad example, right? She was a woman. An idea that a woman and an indigenous woman could be interrupting their plan, right, was a bad example that they were not willing to tolerate, And I think to kill somebody in their home late at night when you're in your, you're most vulnerable, like you're in your jammies, right, and they could have killed her anywhere, right, but they entered her home to do that, and she was shot dead. Trying to defend herself, but shot down. Her friend, a Mexican environmentalist called Gustavo Castro, was in the house. That is the one thing that they didn't know. And he was shot also, and he survived by playing dead, basically. He put his hand up just as the bullet came, but it hit his ear. So there was a lot of blood, and he just lay really still, and the gunman was convinced that he was dead. What the state did, there was complicity before and after with the company and people, members of the state. For example, the police, authorities straight away started saying it was a robbery, right? Classic, then that it was because of internal conflicts in Copin. Then they tried to paint Gustavo Castro, the Mexican, as a suspect. They refused to let him leave the country. And while this was happening, we know now from the phone data that was uncovered during a murder investigation that there was all this going into back and forth between senior people in the company and law enforcement. That one.
How were you able to get this documentation, the phone information?
So this was uncovered during the murder inquiry, right? So I was given access to a lot of the files. Honduras, like the rest of Latin America, their justice systems are based on the Spanish justice system, right? Where you have a state prosecution, but also people who are designated by the court as victims to a crime can run parallel prosecutions, completely, independent parallel prosecutions alongside the state. So her family should have had, are meant to have all the same access to all of the sort of evidence during discovery. Basically, there's meant to be a sharing of that, and so I was sort of getting access to that, and analysing, thousands of pages of phone documents. But you saw these messages, between senior people in the dam company, saying, look, don't worry, the minister, the Minister of Security has told us it's going to be fine. It's going to be a crime of passion. There was all of this complicity going on, but and none of those lines of investigation have ever been investigated, right? What happened in the end was there was such a huge international outcry, here in the US, but in many parts of the world. I mean, she was probably the most famous or well-known activist in Latin America at the time because she'd won the Goldman Prize. You know, she'd been to Rome, had an audience with the Pope not long before, you know, and so all these things that her children thought protected her didn't, right? I mean, they killed her anyway. That's how confident I think their Honduran state and these company executives were that in the impunity that exists in that country.
Nina, I am so fascinated by the work that you've done, and I think, you know, as we sit here, I mean, it's we're entering this new administration. One thing I just have to remind everybody is this all happened in the Obama years.
Yeah.
As I start off the show talking about national security, and the folks who are going to be leading our Defense Department potentially, and our Secretary of State, the State Department, we have to keep these things in mind that these policies came out of the previous administration that led to the instability and, you know, the tactics, while they may not be coming directly from the U.S., they're coming from multinational organizations and companies and banks and in conjunction with governments that, you know, still to this day should be operating. No one's.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say that I think, you know, in the environmental justice world, we talk very much about sacrifice communities, you know, people of color, low income communities, Native American territories. I really believe that for a long time, dating back many sort of administrations, Central America has been considered a sacrifice zone, right? It's where many of the US's worst policies, foreign policies, have been tried and tested, right? You know, and I think now we're seeing that with climate crisis, right? You know, Central America is pretty much a big island surrounded by oceans and seas. The impact of the climate crisis is happening. We've had, you know, a lot of the forced migration from Guatemala last year was being driven by drought. People were starving to death, right? We've seen 2 deadly hurricanes hit Honduras within 2 weeks. Yeah, I mean, in 2 weeks they were there. 1.5 million Hondurans have lost their crops, their homes. You know, the climate crisis is here, and you just think this has been a region that has been considered just, you know, as a plaything, as a sacrifice zone. And so, like you're saying, we didn't start with Trump. Did it get worse? Absolutely, right? But it didn't start with Trump, and I don't think we can't say it's going to end with Joe Biden becoming president. We can't be sure, you know, that things are going to suddenly be great, because I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Nina Lakhani, check out her book. If we can put that up on screen. It's called Who Killed Berta Cáceres. It was published in June of this year. She's also a reporter at The Guardian. Definitely check out her book if you have a chance. We'll put the link in the description. Hope to have you on again soon. Please be safe, be well, and, you know, thank you for your courage, because it takes a lot of courage. Yes.
Thank you very much. See you.
All right, take care, Nina. Something that has existed, I believe, throughout the history of discourse, which is, of course, women who are not, they're not believed. There are threats put on women, whether it's physical, violent threats, rhetorical threats, to pressure them to be quiet or not step up. And this last week, it's so strange because, you know, she discussed in her live stream on Instagram that the idea of trauma, like she'd experienced sexual trauma, and then, you know, trauma doesn't go away, it kind of compounds. And I'm even feeling traumatized watching the discourse in reaction to her discussing this online. And I know you experience attacks all the time. I, of course, do. I know several of our colleagues. What we do on Fridays, just so you know, is this is a show that is dedicated entirely to having women platformed in media, because, you know, there aren't enough women in media, partly because it's not encouraged enough. We doubt ourselves, but also there is this culture that comes at women when they speak out, progressive women in particular. So I'm curious to see, like, what are your thoughts in watching how,
the right wing and the left has questioned AOC's experience. Not that we didn't know that there was violence and that we needed AOC to prove it, but that it was true, that they're making her out to be somebody who's trying to it's all about AOC rather than just listening to a lawmaker, one of many lawmakers who've talked about their experiences. I mean, what's your take on all of this? There's just a lot to unpack.
Well, I mean, I think the interesting backlash to focus on is coming from people who purport to be on the left, because I'm not trying to excuse the behavior of the right wing, but it's more of the same. It's more of what we've seen from the right wing, especially in response to progressive female members of the House of Representatives, right? Like, they've always been pretty vicious toward them. And that's certainly something that needs to be rooted out and discussed. However, I think it's important to focus on the left for the purposes of this discussion, because it has left an incredibly bad taste in my mouth. It has really disgusted me. I find it repulsive. And I don't see it coming from, honestly, like, good faith arguments. So let me explain. And I don't want to get into like gross fighting and naming names. Like, I just want to focus on what the common themes are. So one common theme is that AOC does this live stream in order to deflect and distract from the fact that she was unwilling to work with Ted Cruz on regulating Wall Street. And so the fury, the anger has to do with the fact that she's unwilling to put her own biases aside in order to work with a man who helped to incite the riots that took place in the Capitol that day. Okay. But there's an added layer of stupidity in that argument. And that added layer of stupidity revolves around the fact that Ted Cruz is not a politician who ever has any interest in regulating Wall Street, in regulating big business, in regulating anything, to be quite honest with you.
His wife works for Goldman Sachs, right?
Exactly. So all of this nonsense about like, no, we need to be vicious to AOC because she was unwilling to work with a politician who put her life in danger, who put her safety in danger. And by the way, who isn't even honest about what he wants to accomplish. Let's be vicious because she can't put her own feelings aside. I don't agree with that at all. So again, there's that political component, which is just full of ignorant talking points, and I can't stand it. And then there's the part of it that even if you dislike AOC, which if you're a progressive, you can critique her. There's certainly areas where critique is valuable and necessary, and I applaud people who do that. But constructive critique is very different from what we've been seeing in response to AOC lately. Even if you dislike her, even if you have valid critique toward her, when you message to the world that you don't believe her trauma, you don't believe her lived experience, sure, that might be hurtful to her, but she's unlikely to ever read your stupid Twitter comments. The reality is there are people who are with us on the left, many people who have been survivors of all sorts of trauma, including sexual assault. And what you're doing with that message is giving those allies, giving those people the same feeling that I had when I read those comments, which is, I'm disgusted by this. I find it repulsive. Do I want to be associated with a group of people who might have a similar ideology when it comes to how our economic system should be set up? But I don't want to be associated with them if this is the way that they treat other people in an incredibly vulnerable moment, right?
It's interesting because as I was watching this mob mentality. I mean, it really was. There were several hashtags, disrespectful, grotesque hashtags associated with her name that left me, it reminds me of the Gamergate situation. And, there have been too many think pieces that have come out of Gamergate. But ultimately what Gamergate to me showed was that there are institutional structural biases in these platforms that we live on, and we talk about this a lot on the show, is these big companies, these monopolies have the ability with a literally like a switch to shift the way these conversations are rewarded. I can bet you there are probably, I don't know what percentage, many bots or troll farms pushing certain narratives to attack certain people because they have political agendas or other agendas. And those tech companies know very well which ones are coming from troll farms or bots, and they're not being shut down. The algorithms itself, I mean, on several platforms have been investigated to have very distinct misogynistic bias and racial bias, meaning more prone towards white men. And that's kind of how this culture of Gamergate blew up and has spread onto other platforms. If anything, I hope what comes out of this experience with the coup and the attacks on the squad and other women, whether it's women I don't always agree with, like Maxine Waters or Nancy Pelosi for sure. If anything, I hope with their power that they can bring an investigation and really hold these tech companies to account, because it's no longer, just some gamers. It's no longer just some podcast hosts. It's no longer progressive women out there and activists and writers. This is really spreading to a much more dangerous, got to the halls of Congress, literally. So, you're in this space. I've just been thinking a lot about like the incentive structure and how it's not just that these companies are making money off of it, or Fox News makes money off of having Hillary Clinton's face on every day and Nancy Pelosi's face and Maxine Waters' face, and now it's AOC all day long and Cori Bush all day long. They make money off of misogyny, and women and anybody who wants to stand up for them are afraid. So they are they're effectively silenced, as you said. What do you think, like, do we have to do a better job on the left kind of explaining how these ecosystems work?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. But I think the other side, and I don't know if I'm being unreasonable in wanting this, because I've been thinking about this a lot. What really lacks on the left, even among reasonable, logical leftists who agree with one another and consider one another friends, it's this unwillingness to stick up for one another, and that's been like the most depressing part about all of it, because just like with any struggle, in order to succeed in combating that struggle, you need a collectivist approach, right? You need to organize. People power is incredible. And by the way, quick shout out to the Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, who are trying to unionize, and their union vote has begun under some intimidation by Amazon, of course. But I'm really rooting for them, and I hope they do unionize. But the point here is that there's power in numbers, and what happens with this manufactured online ecosystem with the bots and all of that is that people don't want to have their mentions flooded by sticking up for one another. People don't want, or I think some people are also still under the impression that the majority of those accounts are real accounts, and they don't want. And by the way, and when those accounts start piling up and they start attacking you simultaneously on anything you post, what ends up happening is that it gives real people the impression that you're a bad person, or you're unpopular, or your business is about to implode, like all sorts of nonsense that they just are repetitive
for the CIA,
about.
Or your best friends with Madeline Albright
by NATO, right? Exactly.
Just want to let everybody know this is the NATO-funded portion of this. I can't keep track.
Exactly. I forgot, but maybe later in the show we can do the Clinton Cash funded segment of the show. But anyway,
if we have time,
if we have time. But like, I think that. So I bring him up a lot because I think about him a lot, and I think about him every day and how he would handle certain situations, because I think that he had the right grasp on things. And of course, that's Michael Brooks, and he had this, he really believed in spreading kindness, like being kind to people, but being vicious to systems, right? Being brutal to systems that put us in the positions that we're in today. And so what I loved was that there was this feeling of solidarity and there was this feeling that we had one another's backs, right? And I love that. And we were, protective of one another. And so whenever, let's say, I critique Tulsi Gabbard and her, cultish following decided to come after me, no, he spoke the truth, knowing that they'd come after him too. And I really appreciated that. And I think that solidarity goes a long way in keeping women strong. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about women, it's about leftists overall. But since this conversation is about women, when you feel that you have people backing you, it empowers you, right? It gives you the strength to kind of get past all the bots, get past all the negative feedback that you're getting from dishonest actors. And it gives you the strength you need to keep doing your job, to keep doing the work. So I would say that, definitely it's important to do our jobs in informing people about how these systems work. But on a very personal level, I think it's important for the left to really have one another's backs. And that's not to say to run away from any type of critique or feedback. I think constructive feedback is important because we need to have these discussions to really find the right strategies to move forward. But that's very different from what I've been seeing on the quote unquote left lately. It turns people off, not just people who do podcasts or shows. It turns ordinary people off when, maybe their first, their introduction to the left is one of these videos that includes nothing but juvenile fighting and, nonstop backlash.
Right. No, I mean, that's, there's the misogyny, there's the actual political goals, but there's also just a lot of clicks and money in the fighting. So all of these things, it can be confusing for folks watching, not understanding where the agendas are coming from. Because sometimes they can echo each other. But I mean, on the point of solidarity, I think one thing that I've been trying to do intentionally and with focus, and I wish I did, I'm really happy that you're speaking out about this now too. I wish I had asked for this years ago. It's isolating. When you're being attacked and people don't believe you for whatever reason, or they want to distance themselves because they don't want to get in the crossfire, I think women being attacked online we actually have to ask for help from our male allies because you don't know until you experience it. And I've had a few men recently reach out and say, I had no idea until I just experienced it. And I had no idea. You talk about bots and I thought you were a little bit off there. I'm like, no, it's fun. As soon as they experience it, they realize, okay, this is not organic. We know what organic growth is. You know what organic growth is as you built TYT from the ground up. You know what organic growth is because I've run for office and it's not easy to build that following and the same thing with the show. So, for, I guess my case to the audience would be if you see any one of your favorite, especially women, getting attacked, berated, ignored, dismissed, not believed, have their backs. That's the least we can do. It's hard, but we're targets. And I guess that leads to the next question about AOC and the squad. But I've been thinking a lot about how did this happen? How did her conversation about verifiable events, if this were a court of law and they were trying to basically dismiss her as a witness, okay, call one of 900 million people who saw the videos and say, did you see the security guard's head get smashed in a doorway? Did you see several folks storm the Capitol with guns, with swastikas on their shirt? Oh yeah, you did? Okay, great. Yes, this event happened. I don't really understand, other than putting AOC out there and tearing her down, what the agenda is here. The right wing knows very well that they are caught in a bad situation. Instead of moving on from it, and I don't know, they just are doubling down, tripling down, going after young, progressive, working class background women who have really built their own power. And it's not going to work. That's the most amazing thing is, it's not going to work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the right wing doesn't like what these women represent, right? So the idea of strong women, Cori Bush's speech on the House floor last night was unbelievable. really woke me up. And I can't even begin to tell you guys, like, the thing that I've been struggling with over the last year, especially, has been, after 4 years of the Trump administration, your senses become a little numb, right? Like after one shocking thing after the next, it's hard to feel anything. And so 2 things that really stood out to me was the day that the riots happened. Like, I had CNN on in the background as I was working. And then I start seeing the video footage of what was going down. And it stopped me in my tracks. Like, I literally stopped. And I don't do live videos throughout the day because I'm overwhelmed with work I got to do for the live show. But I hit up our senior producer and I was like, Brett, we need to go live right now. And he's amazing. And he set it all up and we did it. We did a live video. And I did it because that moment woke me up. That moment was like, no, this isn't a joke. This is real. And this is a moment where I don't know where we're going to land. I don't know where we're going to end up. And it was terrifying. And then Cori Bush's speech yesterday, if she was able to give me this jolt of inspiration, imagine what she did for so many other women out there. And the right wing hates that. They hate that. They can't stand that. And I think that you're absolutely right in that, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, even people who consider themselves on the left get persuaded to cover certain topics in certain ways that are rewarded by the algorithm, that are rewarded by these bot campaigns. And so I don't know if it's conscious or subconscious, but I've seen so many people that I had a tremendous amount of respect for throughout my entire career, people who I would urge my journalism students to read, turn around and put out just absolute garbage in response to AOC and in response to the riots. And it's just shameful, but it shows you that, capitalism and the profit motive tied to capitalism works in mysterious ways sometimes. And not even mysterious, but it has the ability to really corrupt someone's logic and reasoning, because we're all trying to survive. And I can tell you, one of the most difficult things is to remain principled when all the incentives are to do otherwise.
It's also it seems to me, and I'm going to assume who some of these people are because I've had the same experiences with people I've been reading since late 90s, I guess. There's a triggering. I mean, because of capitalism, because of the state of media and how hard it has been for decades for independent writers to make a living, to break through. Maybe they did break through. Maybe they were taken off air for being against the Iraq War, or exposing corruption in government, or having fights behind the scenes with producers because they wanted certain stories up there. That stuff wears and tears at you. And I feel like there are people in the left media right now who are having, they're triggered by events and they don't know where to channel their energy. And I mean, I have disagreements with AOC and some of the squad, definitely on some votes, without a doubt. But ultimately, it's like, well, who are our closest allies? Who are the ones who are going to help us the most get our agenda through? And my only suggestion would be, don't target them, target the big folks who are up against it. But I think there's this constant state of warfare that these experiences are triggering some people, in media in particular. And when it goes at a woman, that's when I start to go off and think like, okay, if your trauma is coming out and you're targeting women, then maybe it's time to like really think about how misogyny creeps into all different forms of capital, basically. Like,
yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point. Also, I just think that, like, I think about my own role in media and my own experiences with an incredibly male dominated place, right? it's not just that media is male dominated, it's politics that's male dominated. And so I made a decision, not consciously, but I realized that this is the way I've behaved throughout my entire career, where when I'm confronted with something that's obviously sexist, or when I'm confronted by people who are very clearly underestimating me because of my gender, I steamroll it because there's no other choice, right? Like I pretend like it doesn't exist. And then I just kind of go into overdrive regarding like dominating the person who's doing this like sexist thing by working harder, researching more, doing better in how I broadcast the news, all of that. Like I make them a target, and then I like overcome their sexism by squashing them in ways that they like didn't see coming. Like that's how I've thought about it. But that's not how most women want to operate, right? Because that's not really addressing the core of the issue here. And I think that there's a problem on the left with maybe really considering how some of the rhetoric and how some of the treatment toward women is not only like sexist and all that, but like how it hurts and hinders the movement, right? Because again, we talk about appealing to a broad group of people. We need a broad coalition to succeed. And you ain't going to succeed if you're not going to attract women to this movement. And you're not going to attract women to the movement if you're going to literally attack verbally the most, I would say, popular female politician in this country after she shared something traumatic in her life and was vulnerable with people and was transparent with people, you know?
Transparent and vulnerable, and you're asked as a politician, you know, you get all these trainings and they say, okay, when you give a speech, you know, people relate to you and you're more vulnerable. You are asked to lean in, be vulnerable in sharing these deeply personal stories so that people understand them more, especially with a platform like hers. And there's the opposition, whether conscious or not, tears at you for being human.
Totally.
We had there was an event. I'm on the board of Matriarch, and Matriarch is launching this training program in the spring to recruit working class, labor-oriented women to run for office. And so yesterday there was this fundraiser, and Sarah Nelson was speaking, who's the president of the Flight Attendants Workers, and she said something so powerful. She says, you know, I have been told throughout. You know, she's a female president of the Flight Attendants Workers Union. It's a primarily female made-up union. And she said, you know, I have been told throughout my career that it's not okay to be vulnerable. And she's like, any opportunity I have in front of a lawmaker to be vulnerable, I do, because I want to lean into that. And we have to, that is our superpower as humans, but frankly, as women, she said. And I think that's the superpower AOC. No matter what happens with this whole, it's a teachable moment for many of us. It's probably a teachable moment for many men on the left who didn't even understand until they saw just how aggressive the right wing and some of the left were going at AOC. And I think at the end of the day, as much as it was meant to prevent other people from coming forward, you know, whether it's conscious or not, to be afraid of coming forward and being vulnerable, I think we as a movement need to understand there was so much more power in that more people were educated through AOC, more people were educated through Sarah Nelson being vulnerable at the Capitol when she's pushing for legislation than those who are tearing them down.
Totally.
And it's just, if you're going to have to choose between supporting your sisters, supporting people in the movement who are being targeted, and you don't want to because you don't want to feel it, trust me, the rewards are much, much greater if that's what's going on in your head anyway.
The thing that really appeals to me about the left is that the core of the fight is about ensuring that everyone lives a life of decency.
Yes.
That everyone has a decent life, right? And that goes, yes, it's about material needs. There's no question, but it goes beyond that. Mm-hmm. It's to be decent to one another, right? And so again, a lot of the online discourse has abandoned that. And I don't think, one important thing that I also want to say is, The online discourse isn't indicative of leftists. Like, I think that there are wonderful leftists out there who aren't online, who aren't part of this discourse, and they're actually out there doing the work. And I have nothing but love for them. But, you know, for the purposes of this discussion, the most visual part of the left happens to be online. And it's just, I would just argue that people are a little more thoughtful about the way that they talk about these issues, the way that they talk to one another, not to save their own reputations. I don't care about that, but to really think about whether or not that online discourse is appealing to a broader group of people that we're trying to bring in. Because we're still small and powerless right now. And we need to be real about where we're at. And so what do we do to overcome the corporate media narrative about the left? Because we're really playing into exactly what they want by demonizing a woman who just shared something traumatic about her life.
And not to mention what it takes to get to that position. I mean, the trauma that they had to endure. Cori Bush has run multiple times. She's had her car shot up. She had COVID twice while she was running for office. She had her car taken on the last day of her last campaign for office because she couldn't afford to make payments.
It's crazy.
This is what it takes. This is what it takes. But she knew she needed to win for her community. And then on day one, what she had to face when entering Congress, I mean, this is superhuman. I mean, they are doing what I question whether or not I would have the courage to do one of those things continuously over and over, run for office despite experiencing all of that, and then going there and dealing with not only members in Congress who are conspiracy theorists, who are sexist to their faces, are racist to their faces, and you have to show up and work with them, and then you're scolded for not partnering with them on a bill. It is hard work. And so I commend you for showing up every day and fighting for all of us and fighting for them too, because they need us too. And of course I commend any of our allies out there who have our backs, because it's not easy, whether you're an organizer in the community or AOC, it's not easy.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Nomiki. And I feel the same way about you and everyone else, who's in this fight in good faith and is doing it for all the right reasons. I'm also realistic about where we stand in this fight. We're one small part of, I think, a broader strategy that we need to have in order to accomplish the goals that we want, right? If we have a billion leftist podcasters and leftist TV shows and internet shows, that's not going to accomplish, federal jobs guarantee, Green New Deal, Medicare for all of that stuff, like all the things that we desperately need right now. What we need is to empower people, ordinary people, to come together and fight for what we want. So let's be welcoming to them. I think that's important, and let's have one another's backs, because it's hard enough to fight the far right. It's hard enough to fight regular Republicans like Mitch McConnell, So it's going to really take a lot of people to fight together in an organized way to accomplish what we need in this country.
You guys know, but I'm not a millionaire or a billionaire, and this show is not getting Fox News ratings. We don't have Fox News advertisers. That's called independent media. And even in independent media, there are hierarchies. There are folks who are getting ads from big sponsors. They're getting boosted by other companies. It's a complicated world we live in, but we are truly independent. We're an absolutely independent show. We do this show on a shoestring budget because we know what it takes to get this out there. And if I were doing this for the big bucks, if our team was doing it for the big bucks, it would be different. But with that, when you take that big money, it also changes your priorities. It changes the types of stories you can share, the types of guests you can have on, the honesty and the authenticity that you can share with your audience. We are not part of that. We just decided. I mean, I have worked in the news industry, in the media industry for a long time. I think almost a third of my life at this point. And I know the difference between being part of a big media empire or a small media empire and how that can affect your programming. We don't let it do that. And part of the reason, actually the sole reason, is because we have patrons. We have patrons like many of you who've been supportive all along, who've joined recently, who've come in and out because, let's be real, the economy is tough. But when you go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, we have all different levels, and we also have swag. We're going to be doing some special stuff for our patrons in the coming year. It's going to be very exciting. We have really exciting announcements after the new year. And our patrons are the first to know, and they get the extra content. They get, some of the things that we're going to be putting on. I can't tell you yet. But if you go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, I promise you it makes a big difference. We are a growing community. And I know I've talked about this before, but I think it's worth sharing again. There are very few media shows on the left that are solely hosted by women. It is harder for women to break through the systemic barriers of these algorithms, because the algorithms are really skewed towards male audiences and hosts, but the audiences are, and I think ours is probably one of the stronger, 80%, 90% male. I'm not kidding you. So it's important. This is part of that ecosystem. Google is not creating an easy pathway for a lot of people, especially people of color and women of color. And it does take a lot to put on these shows. So patrons are a big part of that. I just want to thank all of our patrons right now for being so supportive. This has been an incredible process, an experiment in media over the last few years. We're going to be doing some really exciting stuff. In the next year, we're going to be taking on fascism directly and sharing with you how to take on fascism. Because let's be real, that's what we're facing right now. These are the crises that we're dealing with. We're also going to talk more about structural barriers, what's happening with the Democrats, how we can potentially move the Democrats. It's hard, I know, and they're not really stepping up. But I think sometimes we lean on the Democrats to do things that sometimes we in our own community, we can do. It's frustrating at the federal level, but the real change right now is happening locally and at the state level. We're going to help you understand how to do that, how to take these folks on. The conservatives get it. The Steve Bannons get it. The Roger Stones got it. They've been doing it for half a century, at least. And they learned from the previous guys, like the Roy Cohns of the world. So why can't we? We got to think outside the box. And that's what we're going to be giving you on this show. We're not going to be fighting with other commentators. We're not going to be taking on the leftists in the House. We are going to be helping you understand how to build. That is what this is about. We don't have a lot of time, 11 months till elections. And that's why it's so important for patrons like you to be part of this community. We're so grateful to you. And you can join us at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. It's a great New Year's thing too. Something's been going on the last few weeks, but I think it became extremely clear with the storming of the Capitol. There has been a facilitation, whether it's been conscious or not, an enabling, a facilitation of the rise of fascism over at least the Trump years, and it never really went away. But I'll start off with Dave Sirota's piece in Jacobin. Friend of the show, Dave Sirota, makes the case that conditions for the far-right insurrection on the Capitol are not new. They've been created through the support of right-wing legislators, deliberate decisions by law enforcement, and the urging of Trump. Mm-hmm. Francesca, I mean, at this point where McConnell seems to have woken up to something that was right in front of his face the whole time, and he was probably aware of, we have so much work to just rip this apart. And what is it going to take for us to fight? What is it going to take for us to not just expose, but really purge, whether it's fascism, white extremism, white
nationalism, I'm going to say, because there's a nationalist tendency to this. What is it going to take for us?
Oh my God. Everything. So, oh my gosh, so much anti-racist Sesame Street, which I already thought Sesame Street was anti-racist because, you know, it's like everyone's a different color. There's like a, you know, homeless man, you know, there's just like a lot of, it's like, didn't we all learn our lessons back when we learned our ABCs that like, you know, we are all equal, but that's, of course, that's a liberal pipe dream. I'm a lib for even liking Sesame Street. Here's the point. Dave Sirota in that piece basically argues, that we are, in order to root out extremism, we're also going to need positive plans that actually materially help people out. And I think that this is going forward. For me, it's the two-pronged strategy of, or maybe it's three, but one, ignoring the Republican Party. We got the Senate. Y'all can sit on it and rotate. I'm sorry. Like you can go away forever. We don't need you. But that means whipping the Democrats, right? I mean, that means actually having power in the Democratic Party to really deliver for the American people and steer them away from some of this, you know, bonkers conspiracy, you know, the onslaught of right-wing media that is constantly filling their brain with worms, straight up literal worms. And so that is one. It's really not compromising with the Republican Party. And then it's like, okay, well, where are we pushing? Like, where do we go? How do we deliver for people? You know, whether it's a federal jobs guarantee, Green New Deal, more than $2,000 stimulus, like dropping student debt. And then finally, let me just say that for the Sesame Street stuff, like, yo, you guys, there needs to be a federal plan to address racism and, you know, and because I'm calling it what it is, it's white nationalist extremist violence. That is exactly what it is. There needs to be an educational plan coming from the federal government. Like, it should be mandated. It should be mandated to learn about our own history. You cannot paper over the Confederacy. And, you know, as I think many schools in the South have been papered over when they're like, read about, oh, and then there was a disagreement and the Confederate flag is all about patriotism. You know, like,
meanwhile, they're learning this at Robert E. Lee Elementary School.
Totally. So
it's like, it actually, I mean, that's such a great point because in Germany, for instance, granted, we have different free speech laws, which is their loophole. Germany has done they've been so aggressive about amending and making up and re-educating even folks who were, I mean, they're barely alive now, but who lived through World War II. There's been a very strategic effort to do so. And this isn't, you know, Germany's not the only place, but do you think that, I mean, I start off the show saying, like, this is our moment. We got to start talking to people now before they get distracted by something else, which they're already starting to do. Fox News is already talking about, well, BLM was just as violent and you know, okay, yes, the violence was really bad the other day, but also BLM was really violent. I mean, that's their messaging now because they're trying to pivot to something. They're grasping.
Sure.
But while we have them in the moment, while we have Senator Lindsey Graham, while we have McConnell really calling out Josh Hawley, calling out Ted Cruz, calling out Donald Trump, while we are about to go into another impeachment, we got to get something. Channeling our inner Jane McAlevey, we got to get something through this. And maybe it's just that.
And I mean, to be honest with you, I do think there has to be accountability. And that's been the biggest problem, sadly, throughout our whole history is there hasn't been accountability for insurrectionism, for, you know, like even after the Civil War, like there was, I believe, I can't remember, maybe it was when slavery ended that like white people, white former slave owners got reparations for the money they lost because they could no longer own slaves. So that is the world we're in. And we started with that Reconstruction, right? You know, when there were actually Black officials from the South elected to local and to federal government. And then, of course, there was an entire white backlash and they formed the KKK, et cetera. So like, it is accountability. And for me, I don't see a difference between holding, you know, never ever holding those former Confederate states accountable to what we just saw the other day. How are we holding Republican lawmakers who, I'm just going to say it, they're an insurrectionist party. Noam Chomsky called the Republican Party the greatest, the organization that poses the greatest threat to life on earth. Like, you know, whether it's climate change, white nationalism, like that's not hyperbole anymore.
No.
So it is, what is the accountability? How, you know, I think Cori Bush is doing a good thing in terms of trying to get these folks to resign. But for me, I'm like, I don't know if that's going to happen, but it should. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I'm also like, I don't ever want to hear a Republican say anything else unless it is, here is my plan to stop the extremism in this country. Here is my plan to stop white nationalism. That's it. Like if on MSNBC, if you're a former Republican, you know, Michael Steele, I don't care about your moralisms. No. How are you going to stop the white nationalism that you allowed to fester in your party beginning before Obama, but absolutely under Obama? What are you going to do? Or do you let that party go? Are you making a new party? You can't have the Democratic Party as much as they're trying to infect us.
The Lincoln Project. Maybe you should add amending your party's racial positioning as one of your multi-million-dollar ad campaigns. That would be great. Just a thought. Okay, so the Republican Party needs to be crushed. The racism in the Republican Party needs to be crushed. White supremacy needs to be cracked down on, and folks need to be arrested and prosecuted. This is the only time I'm ever going to call for police to arrest folks. Arrest these motherfuckers. Because this was horrifying. And if you're part of it, they should be investigated and arrested. And the FBI, whose investigations have been going on for over a decade, what are you doing about it?
No, I mean, I think that the directive since Trump got in office was to shut down a lot of the investigations that had been started into some of these, you know, far right militant organizations. So we have to reopen those. And look, all we're asking is for you to treat these insurrectionists the same way you treat, you know, a Black Lives Matter demonstrator, someone protesting against the IMF and World Bank, the Iraq War, Occupy Wall Street, you know, someone who did property damage, people who have been charged with federal crimes and, you know, and facing like 70 years. Like they're in the insane ways that, and look, I'm not saying that's good, but like, you can't, if you wield justice in that way, you know, it's time to wield it once again, except against actual threats to, because once again, these people don't believe in government. No. You know, I think that the left, we are critical and cynical of government, of course, especially cynical of the amount of money that flows through it. But we ultimately are trying to make these institutions better and more representative. These folks don't believe it. They think they hate the police. All the police, they're trying to, you know, they're trying to tell you what you can and can't do. They're trying to tell you that you shouldn't have, you know, shouldn't be able to walk around with your AR-15 or whatever it is, you know?
All right, guys. Happy New Year. We will see you in 2022. We're really grateful to all of you. And if you are all, I mean, if you have, this is the time going into the new year, we are going to offer you a playbook on how to fight fascism. This is what we're doing now. It is all about what we can all do collectively as individuals in our own communities to make a difference, because it's going to happen in numbers. We see what they're doing. We should not wait for the Democrats to come and save us or any other organizations to make any moves. We have some stuff that we can do with the power, you know, we have in communities, the time that we have, if we are able to. We're going to show you that pathway. And it's going to be a tough year. So if you have the opportunity to rest up, please rest up. And of course, as always, stay in solidarity. See you in 2022.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from a leech, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.